Terrific. Hello. Welcome, everybody. It's 3 minutes past, so I think this is a good time to get started. My name is Rebecca Lemon, and I am the new director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. And this is my very first book event. I'm really excited that it's Mike's book. So thank you so much for joining today. For a conversation about Michael Messner's new book, The High School: Sports, Spirit, and Citizens, 1903 to 2024, which was published by Rutgers University Press just now in 2025. We invite everyone who is able to please turn on your camera if that's at all possible. It's so much of a nicer occasion if we can see the faces of colleagues and friends who are here to support Mike in his work. I also know the challenges that come with this kind of multimodal thing, but thank you. Oh, it's so nice. It's so nice to see so many of you now. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that our panelists do too. So joining us today is CJ Pascoe, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon, and Jeffrey Montez de Oca, who's Professor and Chair of Sociology and the founding director of the Center for the Critical Study of Sport at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And then today's conversation will be moderated by our colleague here at USC, Alice Echols, who is the Barbara Streisand Chair of in Gender Studies and in History. Today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Department of Sociology and the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. The program is quite simple. We will start with a very short introduction to the book by Professor Messner himself. Then he will be in conversation with Professor Montez de Oca first, and then with Professor Pascoe for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. So 15 minutes for each of them. And then at that time, we open the floor to all of you to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand. That just makes it easier for Zach, I believe, to kind of help make us make it clear the order of things. So Mike, many congratulations on your wonderful book, and let's begin with you telling us about it, please.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks to the Levan Institute for this kind introduction and invitation. Thanks to Alice Echols and Jeff Montez de Oca and CJ Pascoe, three people whose work I respect so much and who I've learned so much from. So really appreciate their taking the time to do this with us. And I did want to say at the outset, I have a really bad head cold, and it's possible I might start coughing or sneezing, and we have a backup setup. Alice is going to jump in if that happens, but my voice, I think, will most likely probably hold out for this time. So a couple things about the project and a couple ideas maybe to put on the table. This is a book that is based upon my reading of 120 plus years of the Salinas High School annual yearbooks starting in 1903. And it's a book that has 270 photographs that are reproduced from the old and newer yearbooks. And it started with my having inheriting really my father's 20-some yearbooks from the years where he was a teacher and a coach at the school, and then my own 4 yearbooks from when I was a student at the school. And it was probably over 20 years ago, I got the idea of doing something with these books after I inherited them from my father. But I really just started collecting them, and eventually collected about 100 copies of the book. And the others that I didn't own, I accessed at the high school's archive. And it's a book that really focuses on the in a very large sort of way on the broad question of how high schools shape citizens, and it kind of goes back to the 100 plus years ago, the progressive reformers, John Dewey and others, who saw high schools as ways to shape democratic citizens in an otherwise very hierarchical society. And more specifically, I zero in on a topic that I've studied a lot over my career, and that is organized sports. And I really ask, what does sports cheering and school spirit do in high schools, and how does that change over time in terms of creating citizens and creating barriers and boundaries sometimes, and then openings for the creation of citizens. Um, and a sort of theme that runs through the book really is the unevenness of social change. And a lot of people, probably not most academics, certainly not most historians, but a lot of people, I think, have this sort of sense of a sort of linear progress. Things are getting better, and it's pretty easy not to believe that anymore right now, I think. But I think the sports narrative that's very well known is the sort of Title IX narrative that uh, girls weren't allowed to play organized sports in the period of time before 1972 in high schools, and then Title IX passed, and then you see a blossoming, and then eventually a huge growth in girls sports in high schools, and that's reflected in the yearbooks. You see the growth of coverage of girls sports, the growth of respect for girls sports in the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades since the passage of Title IX. But I think what that narrative really misses is if you go back a little bit deeper, quite a bit deeper to the beginning of the 20th century, um, there was a very active and vibrant movement of girls and women playing sports in this country, and that was reflected in high schools, including at Salinas High School, where girls were playing interscholastic competition baseball. They had a baseball team, they had a track and field team, they had a basketball team, and other sports. And the yearbooks covered them not exactly equitably with the way they covered boys' sports, but in very respectful sorts of ways. Pictures of the girls wearing their uniforms, reporting on their competitions with other local schools. Um, so I think one of the first things I think that's important about the book is the way it kind of documents that there was that early sort of wave of athletic feminism, then it faded out and was really there was a strong backlash against it by the mid-20s and into the 1930s. And then you have a 50-year period where you have no interscholastic competition for girls. Girls who want to sports are kind of put into this bubble of the Girls Athletic Association, which is mostly an intramural kind of program. What's also going on there, I think that's really important, is that there's this turbulence in boys' sports from the very beginning. Boys, right at the beginning of the 20th century, football teams, baseball teams, track and field is very big. But football, which is really huge in the first decade of the 20th century, then is eliminated in 1909, following the lead of Cal, Stanford, and other universities in the nation, where there were a lot of deaths in 1909 on football fields and a lot of violence among spectators and players. And instead, Salinas High, again following the universities, develops rugby instead. And rugby is the sort of main sport alongside track and field and baseball for several years. But then when World War I comes around, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, girls are still playing sports and very enthusiastically doing so at the beginning of the 1920s. But as the war ends, there's a lot of fears of social feminization of boys, and fears that the boys who had been drafted into the army were not strong enough, fit enough, and so there's a militarization of boys' physical education and of sports. And you see some of the yearbook photos of the coaches during that period of time actually wearing military uniforms. And it's during that period of time when the backlash against girls' sports happens. And then in subsequent decades, you see the rise of what I call the sports spirit complex. And there's I sent around to the participants here today a copy of the introduction and of chapter 3. So you have a copy of chapter 3, and there's a diagram of the sports spirit complex on page 131. But it's essentially a collectivity of um, organized efforts by the school and by student groups, starting really with boys athletics and centering boys football, and to a lesser extent basketball, and then adding in this sort of cheering and spirit apparatus that really starts with the development of cheerleaders in the early 20th century. There's a lot of hand-wringing in the yearbooks in the 19 teens and 20s and early 30s that the students aren't getting out to support the football team and the track and field team, and especially kind of guilt-tripping the girls to do that. So they vote to start instituting two positions for two boys to be yell leaders. And that's really the beginning of the sports spirit complex that develops and really blossoms fully in the mid 20th century. You have a marching band, you have cheerleaders, you have pom-pom girls, you have well-established rituals like homecoming week and homecoming parades. You have really amazing initiation rituals in the middle 20th century for a couple of decades, where football players and sometimes basketball players, like myself, I was a basketball player, in order to be initiated into the Block S Society, the sort of boys' honorary society of athletes, you have to put on girls' clothes and parade in front of the entire school. And so some of those initiation rituals and then all school rallies where football players would dress up in girls' clothes in increasingly exaggerated sorts of ways, with huge false breasts and makeup all over their faces. And some of the girl cheerleaders would dress up as cheerleaders. You have these sort of gender inversion rituals happening that are fun, and I call all of those things together kind of pageants of gender that really following the wonderful work of John Ibsen and his book Picturing Men, which is he coins the term pageants of masculinity in all of the photos that he is examining up until the middle of the 20th century. So I think maybe I'll just stop at that as an introduction and sort of give way to Jeff, and happy to dialogue with Jeff and CJ and Alice and others as we go along.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'll get started. So the first thing I want to do is have a disclaimer. I have to say up front that Mike Messner was my graduate advisor, and several of my academic siblings are here. And I can speak for all of us and say we think Mike walks on water. If you want like that hard criticism of the book, you are not going to get it from me. And if I did publicly criticize Mike, my wife would be really mad at me. So that's just not worth it. Um, yeah, so actually it's funny. I was actually still in grad school when Mike started this project. I remember he came back, I don't know if you'd come back from visiting home in Salinas or you just had your dad's yearbooks at that point and you had started looking through them and you were really excited about looking through these yearbooks and yeah, that was like 20 years ago. So it was a long time ago that you first started. So it's really just fantastic to see this thing come together and now be out in a very hardbound edition. If you haven't seen the book, it's beautiful. It looks like a high school yearbook. It's the kind of book you leave on your coffee table. So, well, one of the things that where I want to start is reading the high school was really poignant for me and very bittersweet, as I suspect it was for other people that read it, because, high school is such an emotionally charged time for all of us. A lot of us have really ambivalent memories about high school. This was really compounded because when I started reading the book, I was actually taking a trip back to California for my 40th high school reunion. So the 40th, and that was the first reunion I actually ever made it to. So my reunion and the reading Mike's book, The High School, kind of came together, and that was very powerful for me. And I like, Mike, how you recognize in the last chapter, or maybe it's in the whatever the methodological chapter, where you start talking about nostalgia and how powerful nostalgia is. And you recognize that nostalgia is a tool that marketers use, politicians use to sell us a whole range of different kinds of commodities, and yet you don't shy away from nostalgia. You're very clear about that, that you couldn't shy away from it even if you wanted to. And I think this is really important because people that like study nostalgia, they talk about this, how in a world that is structured by contingency, nostalgia provides us temporal anchors that help us to organize our lives. And so even if you have an ambivalent relationship with your high school and your high school years, that's still a really important marker for all of us. And it's something that's generally shared because of, as you said, the work of John Dewey and other folks. The other thing is that nostalgia has the potential for progressive social change. We can be nostalgic for radical activism. Um, and Mike, you're like openly nostalgic for the girl sports of the 1920s, right? This time when girls were active in sports before the time period that you came along, that wasn't an option. And so we look back on these things and they provide a model that can inspire us for the future. And I think right now, when we're experiencing a tremendous amount of contingency and antagonisms, there is some use for nostalgia in terms of creating a vision for what, based on what's been for what can be in the future. One of the other things that just really struck me while I was reading your book is that each yearbook is like a snapshot for you of a particular year in the history of Salinas High School or Salinas Union High School and Salinas High School. And we can imagine, as you're going through this, each of these snapshots is like a card in a card deck. And then the old trick where you flip the cards and then the images start to move, right? Each individual yearbook is pretty static, but as you flip through these yearbooks like they're cards in a deck, we see this history come to life, right? That uneven social change that you were talking about, and the movements in some cases, in a lot of cases, right? You find them to be really surprising. So I think that's something else that's just really cool about the book. But being mindful of the time and making sure I leave time for CJ. So I'm supposed to start with a question, and I'll give you a choice, Mike. Do you want a question that's more methodological or more sport oriented?
You decide, Jeff.
Okay, we'll go with the methodological one because this really just like stuck out in my head the whole time I was reading this book. I just kept thinking about this. So it forced me to reflect upon my own senior yearbook from 1985. And so what struck me in 1985 when I got that yearbook was it really reflected the yearbook staff, the kids that actually put together the yearbook. I remember in that when I got it and I was going around and getting signatures, I was like, the best way to be in this yearbook is to be friends with somebody on the staff because it was so overrepresented by their friends. And now I look back on that yearbook, right? Because then I had to go do some research and I dug my yearbook out, which also was like another level of ambivalence and flipped through it and I looked at it very differently after reading your book. And then I actually grabbed my son's senior yearbook from 2 years ago, and that was an interesting study in comparison. But in any case, one of the things that characterized, I grew up in Berkeley, California in the 70s and into the mid 80s. And one of the things that characterizes Berkeley is, or at least back then, was tremendous racial strife and antagonism that manifested in lots of different ways. And it wasn't just race, it was about class and where people lived in town. And if you look at the yearbook, one, that tension is not there. You don't see it. And it's way overrepresented by the middle class white kids who predominated in that yearbook staff. And so really, I'm asking you to speculate a bit because I know you can't talk to the yearbook staffs from over 120 years. But to speculate on the role of the yearbook staff and then the faculty advisor / censor, and how they might have influenced this construction of the high school.
Yeah, great question, Jeff. I think that the yearbooks are shaped, of course, by to a great extent by the advisor, and you can actually see at a point in time as you're flipping through these cards. I love that image that you gave me there. As you're flipping through the cards, sometimes there's a little break, and the shape and tone of the yearbooks changes a bit, and it's often because the yearbook advisor has changed. So there's a lot of shaping power, I think, involved in the yearbook advisor. And then I think it was somewhere in the 1930s or something, there's a national organization that advises high schools on yearbooks and school newspapers that started putting out a template for yearbooks. And in recent decades, it's gotten much more specific, like what proportion of a yearbook should be about sports, et cetera. So there are templates out there nationally, and yearbooks are actually judged against that template as they enter contests to see if they can win an award for their yearbook. And then, of course, what you're suggesting also, I think, too, is that yearbooks have long reflected the sort of status systems within schools, the sort of cliques that are within schools, and uh, it, it's this was very evident. I mentioned this, I think, in the appendix, that this is very evident in my family, that my older sister Terry was a head cheerleader, and she's splashed all throughout her senior yearbook. And I was a basketball player and was in some clubs, and so I have some pictures in my yearbook. My sister Melinda, who's 2 years older than me, only her senior photo is in the book. Like a lot of kids who aren't, insiders, or aren't high status kids, or aren't outstanding athletes or cheerleaders or something like that. And so I think, that kind of, and you said, I can't speak for the kids on the yearbook staffs. I can't, but when I was when I was writing the book, I was visiting the high school and going through their archive and talking to teachers and coaches, and I did visit the the class that put together the 2024 book, and it was for a whole class meeting. I was able to talk with them, and it was very fun. And I brought this up to them, like I kind of gave them a simple sort of frame theory thing. It was like your book, and any book is sort of has a frame around reality, and like your decisions about what's going to go inside that frame and what's going to be left out of the frame. And interestingly, this is a school that's undergone a lot of demographic change over the years. It was predominantly a white school when I was a kid, with a good number of Asian American kids, and it's now only about, I think, 18 or 20% people who define themselves as all white. And this yearbook staff was almost all girls. The yearbook class, I think, let's say there were about 30 of them. I'd say 28 of them were girls, and almost all of them were Latinas. And when I asked them this question about what's going to go in the book, the two that spoke out, one of them might have become the editor, said that they were determined to have this be an inclusive book, that wasn't going to be just about the popular kids, and that it was going to have a lot of humor in it. In fact, it did have a good number of puns in it, as it turned out, as I saw that 2024 book. So I think, the kids, students have a lot of input. I would love to know a little bit more about the decisions about which photographs are chosen, how captions are decided on and written, and I do a lot of analysis of captions in the sort of mid 20th century, especially the very insulting ones about girls' sports that were dominated for about 15 or 20 years in the 50s and 60s. So yeah, I guess, does that answer your question, Jeff? Yeah, thanks.
And I think that actually we need to move on to CJ.
Okay.
Hi there.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I need to make one little correction for all of the women academics here on this call. I'm a full professor, not an associate professor, Rebecca. I think you're given the wrong information. And
Oh, I'm so sorry. I looked online. So congratulations to you.
yeah, well, it took a
Yay.
while, but I just needed to say that in a moment when we're talking about a book that's about, enshrining gender inequality. So we don't have to get stuck in the housekeeping that academia requires of us. So thank you so much for having me here today. Mike, you know that I can never get enough of high school, and this book was a delightful book to read, right? It's a sociological study, it's a historical narrative, it's a personal memoir, all in one. And much like Jeff and many of us here, I found myself looking back on my own high school experiences while reading it and thinking about them with this sort of historical lens. And in that sense, the high school is a great example of what we call the sociological imagination, right? This ability to see our own experiences as part of a larger swath of history, a way to understand that our high school achievements, our disappointments, our delights may not have been idiosyncratic, but part of these larger social processes. And that's sort of really hitting home with me, particularly in this moment as I have a high school classmate on this very Zoom. Hi, Stacy. Thank you for being here. So she can call me out if I make some wrong claims about my own high school. And I have to sort of, Jeff and I were sort of circling around similar themes because I was in the yearbook everywhere, right? And part of the reason I was in the yearbook everywhere was that I was the assistant editor of the yearbook. So, yearbook kid right here. And I didn't play any sports, right? And so the way I did appear in the yearbook was very much as an insider, right? As one of those middle-class white girls who was involved in sort of every club and part of that sort of internal complex of the school. But I want to highlight one particular way I showed up in it, because I think it really speaks to some of the claims that you make, Mike, about change and lack thereof. So, like many high school yearbooks, our high school yearbook had a set of senior superlatives, right? Where you like vote on like most popular, most likely to succeed, funniest, worst car, all of these things. My senior year, we had a category called most romantic. And I, the school feminist, was voted along with Mike, the school chauvinist, as the two most romantic seniors, something that I think to this day was still sort of a big joke, right? And the picture that they took of us to accompany this award really instantiated some messages about whiteness and about heterosexuality. In this picture, Mike, a tall, probably 6 foot, white senior, was wearing jeans, a button-down shirt, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat. I was wearing something that now I would describe as like a trad wife dress, right? This like long, flowered, very conservative dress. And there he is dipping me backwards as if we're sort of mid-dance, right? And so when I look back at that, I think, wow, what sort of messages were encoded in the yearbook around romance, around heterosexuality, around a sort of valorization of whiteness and coupledom, that sends this really sort of interesting message about what was valued in the late 80s and early 90s when I was attending high school. So I share this story because it's funny, but it's also a really good example of the work that yearbooks do, both in the moment and historically, in a way that affirms and constructs, sometimes challenges reality. And I was most struck by this dynamic regarding gender and its intersections with racial inequality throughout the high school. Specifically, the simultaneity of massive changes around gender inequality since the origins of Salinas High School, as well as the durability and shifting appearance of gender inequality over the years. And that actually leads me to my first question. I really want to return to this phenomenon you describe as pageants of gender, right? These pageants you saw emerge in the post-war years and then sort of developed through the 70s, right? This time when boys' sports became really visible and valued and girls' sports kind of became invisible for a while. And so you describe these pageants of gender as rituals and images that affirm these so-called natural differences between boys and girls, right? Boys dressing up as girls for laughs, as an example. And then, like later in the book that these pageants shift as powder puff football, right? Powder puff is this sort of football game where boys often dress up as girls and the girls play football, but it's only flag football. And for a long time, these were a sort of a big joke in schools. But as Mike documents, these powder puff football games maybe become less of a joke about how girls can't play sports and a legitimate game of flag football. However, it is, of course, still flag football, not full contact football. And so I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about these pageants of gender and the work they did, and maybe think about how we might be entering into a new age of gendered pageantry with some of the panics we're seeing around gender and sport. So I'll leave it at that question for right now.
Yeah, thank you, CJ. Um, well, I guess I would start with the powder puff football because I think one of the things that's so interesting about powder puff football, which really starts emerging in the 1960s, I guess, but takes off as a really big a lot of pageantry around it in the 70s and 80s and beyond, um, is the way it reveals the kind of asymmetries in gender on high school campuses. And there have been people who've written about this before, but I certainly see it in the photographs, and I try to analyze it in the high school that um, that the girls who enter into playing powder puff football, um, generally speaking, it seems very clear that they are taking this very seriously. They practice, they have plays. You can see the look on their faces in the action shots that it's built into the sort of text or quotes around it from the girls. On the other hand, the boys who are some of the boys, and these are all football players, work as coaches for the girls' teams, which sort of sets up an authority structure that's very, very familiar. But also, the boys who are the cheerleaders are really goofing it up. I mean, it's clearly not that they're trying to kind of cross, as Barry Thorne used to talk about crossers, legitimate crossers. They are trying to actually caricature girl cheerleaders in ways that fully distance themselves from it. So the sort of what that ritual really shows, I think, is the asymmetry in the sort of popularity, power, status that are attached to the things that boys do and the things that girls do. And just 2 years ago, at Salinas High School, really reflecting schools in California and some other states, Salinas High School instituted flag football for girls, an interscholastic competition. Because powder puff football was really just an intramural one-off that had a lot of pageantry around it, and people had a lot of fun with it, but it wasn't really considered a serious sport. It didn't count for sort of Title IX, for instance, calculations of girls' sports. But now they've created this high school interscholastic flag football. And when they were doing, I was just in the process of writing up the book when they were creating this 2023, 24, and I remember asking the athletic director, well, what's going to happen to powder puff football now that girls actually have a serious sport that they can play that's interscholastic? He says, oh, the kids want to continue with it because they have so much fun with it. And they did, but I'm not sure how long that will last. I expect that might just fizzle out. Because girls have swarmed into playing flag football. The first year, 2024, they had a varsity team. The second year, they had a varsity and a JV team. And incidentally, what this does for Title IX calculations is it finally creates a sport where there's enough bodies in this sport that might start closing the gap, because it's, in 1972, nationally, girls were only about 7% of all the high school athletes in the United States. As of 2023, the last number I had, it was about 43%. So there's still a gap there with a lot more boys playing. And that's mainly explained by the existence of boys football, where hundreds and hundreds of boys play boys football. So it might start closing that gap a bit. But it also, I think, raises questions. And I had a op-ed in the LA Times a couple of weeks ago about this, and where, start of school and girls are swarming into flag football. What does it mean that girls don't play the same sport that boys play? And partly you can look at that pretty simply in understanding sort of history of girls' sports. Susan Kahn's great work on the history of girls' sports, and Nancy Thabers, who wrote about the development of adapted sports for girls going way back into the early 20th century, that when girls' sports have been developed, be it basketball, girls play softball, not baseball, even though there's a long history of girls and women playing baseball. That this is kind of a reflection of that, protective legislation that existed also in workplaces that kept women incidentally away from jobs that paid more than than they could get into. So, but also kind of flip the question on that, and I ask, if we really know now that tackle football is too dangerous for girls, why do we tolerate it for boys? Why do we celebrate it for boys? And I think a lot of that has to do with, A, we really haven't thought that deeply about boys and men and health and the ways in which, adherence to narrow conceptions of masculinity is very costly for boys and men in terms of their health. And B, we don't really want to look straight in the face at the investment that we have in high school football. I was in Texas last week, which is where I might have caught this whopper cold. And Texas high school football is huge. And there was a piece, I think it was in the Washington Post, I'm not positive of that, just a couple weeks ago, about the 10 most expensive high school college stadiums in the country. 9 of them were in Texas and 1 in Georgia. But just getting back to Salinas, when they needed a new turf in 2003 and they didn't have the money to do it, they went into the community and got agribusiness and big companies to put in hundreds of thousands of dollars to put in the new turf. And then there's the emotional investment in football. It's incredibly deep, the emotional investment that because football for many decades has been at the center of the creation of collective identity and all of that is highly ritualized through homecoming weeks and parades and rallies and local mass media and so forth. So there's a deep investment in boys football, and you can really see that developing in those middle decades of the 20th century as a sports spirit complex sets it up. Alice, you seem to be
Yes.
Okay.
This is a marvelous discussion, and I have no doubt that both Jeff and CJ could continue firing questions at Mike, and this has just been terrific. But I do think that we need to turn to people in the audience, and if you want to ask a question, the best way to do it is to use the raise hand feature under React in the Zoom toolbar. And then I will call on you. And I am looking to see if there is a hand. Maybe in the interim, while you guys conjure up a question, I will pose a question. One is, I've loved reading your book. I did find it rather depressing the way that it took me back to my own high school experience and yearbook. But obviously central to your book is the whole question of representation, Mike. And as you say in the appendix, and it's a great appendix, these yearbooks, which are, after all, as we've been talking about, chronicles of kind of the top girls and the top boys, led you to really have to read against the grain. And I wondered if you could take us through one photograph where you show us girl athletes and women coaches pushing back against institutionalized sexism through this practice of reading against the grain.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. And I guess I would say too, just generally, I tried to do that as much as I could by drawing from the work of other scholars and historians. Carol McKibben's great book on Salinas. I mentioned Susan Kahn's history of girls and women's sports in the U.S. Because it is pretty focused what's inside the frame of a high school yearbook, and it's hard to sometimes understand what might be going on unless you know the broader context. So pre-World War II, the rise of Japanese American girls, I think in the school and in organized sports, I was able to understand that better by reading Susan Kahn's work, and also Nicole Willems, a great book on Japanese American basketball along the West Coast. But the one photograph that I guess I would think of, and as I mentioned earlier, that I guess everybody got sent out the chapter 3 and on page 124 of chapter 3. I won't put it up to the camera here, but the picture of the girls running on the track who were practicing for the turkey trot in 1966. And it stood out to me when I first saw it as a book that was as a picture that was anomalous. It didn't fit with all the other pictures of the girls in those in that period of time. Very few photos of girl athletes, very few, and of the ones that were pictured, they were often they would never mention their names. There would just be sort of an insulting, disparaging caption. This photograph had these girls running really hard, determinedly on the track. It named them who they were, and it said that it was just descriptive. It said, you know, they're practicing or training for the local turkey trot. Now, I didn't know at first what to do with that picture, but I serendipitously ran into one of the women in the picture. This kind of points also, I think, to the limits of just doing a textual analysis, right? If you can do an interview or you know, with somebody who is actually in the picture, suddenly the story opens up to you. But she told me that this was a group of girls who loved running and they wanted to compete. Yet there was nothing in 1966 for them to compete against. And you can see in the picture, they're all running in their onesie gym suits, blue gym suits that all the girls had to wear for PE. And so she told me they ran the stadium steps. They ran over to the local junior college with the boys track team and tried to run with them. And then they entered into the turkey trot. And one of them actually took second place in it. And the turkey trot is a community Thanksgiving kind of mini marathon. And one of the girls took second place, and she was not recognized by the people who were running the race because she was a girl. And so, so that kind of story, I think, helps me to sort of just imagine and think about what's going on around the edges, what's going on below the surface. 1966 up to 1972, and even before that, girls wanted to play sports, and disproportionately, you can see in all the GAA photos, it's disproportionately girls of color who wanted to play sports and were playing in the GAA. But that generation of girls, 1966, you know, they were really bumping up against the ceiling there in terms of their desires. And yet their agency was, we're going to figure out a way to do this and make a statement in the community that we're runners. And those girls, I also can imagine, I mentioned in the book that, you know, those are the girls who a few years later, it's their generation really who launched that wave of feminism and that really blow up that wave of feminism in the 1970s. And it was those kind of experiences that they had, among many others, that I think they were drawing from to build feminism that expanded those kind of opportunities, in this case, to play sports for girls and women that we kind of take for granted now that those exist, but they exist because of a social movement.
I think I see a hand from Kristen. I think you have to.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is so great. Thank you so much. So as a caveat, I have not read the book yet, and I can't wait to. This is a great introduction to that. So forgive me for this question, but I think because of that, this is a very selfish question. I teach the big introduction to sociology class, and there's about 240 students in it. And we just started a couple weeks ago, and it's early in the morning. And I asked the students, how many of you, is this your very first college level class? And about 239 hands went up. And I just think that the students would love this book. It seems really accessible. I know some of the other things that you've read are really accessible. And so my question is, have you thought about, or if you haven't, maybe you could sort of spitball here about either what chapter or chapters they would be the most interested in, if you are planning on having any teaching resources or know of anyone who is, or just like a fun activity or a way that I could incorporate this into my class, particularly the one-on-one class, but I can really see its applicability in an ed class, a youth class, a methods class, a gender class, right? So I think you get the spirit of the question. Any ideas for implementing this in the classroom?
Yeah, thank you. So I experienced this last week when I was in Austin, because Christine Williams is using my book in an intro gender class, undergrad gender class, and so I went to her class, and she's having them read the whole book. But I think, and then she had them write out questions for me, and they're very excited about the book. But I think one of the things she's asking them to do is to, you know, examine their own high school yearbooks. And I'd had this idea before. Kids could bring their own high school yearbooks, read them critically, trade them, compare them with their neighbor, put them in small groups with yearbooks from different parts of the country. Some universities and colleges, though, some of our students aren't from the U.S. or from Canada, where they do have high school yearbooks as well. And so I think one of the things that some of her students have done, and there's a couple other people who told me they're going to be using it in intro classes. And what they're going to have the students do is go into the archive of their university or college and pull out their yearbooks from their own school's archive and examine the history and kind of, have research questions about them, about race. How is race depicted over time? How does it change or not change? Who's in certain clubs, and sports is certainly a really big one in any high school yearbook. Um, but yeah, I think there are ways in which having something like this for students can get them to kind of plumb their own experience, which is very, very recent in many cases, not always, but in many cases, they're right out of high school. And then also a way to get them to dive into the history of their own institution that they're all a part of.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great idea. Nyan, you are up next.
Hey, Mike, what an exciting book you have here. I mean, I haven't read it either, but I'm really thrilled by the way in which you described it, and also particularly the insights about sports and gender pageants. That's really fascinating. I guess I'm going to approach this question with like other parts of the yearbook that you haven't discussed. And I say that also with a similar insight to Jeff, that I went to my 40th high school reunion, in which I hadn't been to any of them since I think maybe my 10th, and how interesting it was to engage the people that were there, and also to look at the yearbook, and to find ourselves in the yearbook or not find ourselves in the yearbook. And I wanted to know a little bit about what you thought about the other kinds of clubs and activities that happened at Salinas High over 100 some years. I'm thinking about theater and drama. I'm thinking about music. I'm thinking about the academic nerdy ones that were there, because their representation was always about being literally on the margins of what was the most important thing of being in the university. And yet, my own experience at high school reunion recently was many of the people that were there were from those places, like, and those spaces. So in some way, not to say that the sports guys weren't there and the most popular kids weren't there too. They were, they organized it. But the people who showed up, at this one at least, were among the rest of us. And I'm curious about what your insights about that are, maybe how they changed over time or what mattered.
Yeah, thanks. And nice to see you, Nyan. Um, uh, yeah, so when the book came out, I did this book launch in Salinas, and one of the things I got to do was an assembly at the school with about 750 students, and they asked me to do two of them, but I said I don't have that much wind in my sails right now, so I'll come back and do another one, but not two in one day. But one of the kids asked me a question: if you were back in high school now, what would you do differently than what you did in high school? And I said, if I knew what I know now, I would get involved a lot more with kids who are not just jocks, because I hung out with the jocks and I was a jock. And I would get involved with the kids who were in theater and the kids who were in music and at other clubs. And I said, and I came to realize years after high school, those were the really cool kids. Those are really interesting kids. But we were all so separate. We all had these little boundaries around us. And in terms of the clubs, over time, It's pretty interesting. I do kind of touch on this throughout the high school, throughout the book, that some of the many of the clubs in the early and mid 20th century were very sex typed. I mean, you would have future secretaries of America as all girls, future farmers of America was all boys, and etc. Future teachers was almost all girls, and so you had these sort of occupational ones that were clearly channeling kids into gender-typed occupations. And then, somewhere around 30 years ago, the Future Farmers of America, some girls are admitted, and then that's desegregated in that way. And you also have some really interesting in the years before World War II kind of racial ethnic clubs. There's a Filipino club. There's a Japanese American club, which is huge. It's 14% of the student population in the year right before the war. And then, of course, they all disappear from the yearbook the following year because they're all interned and in concentration camps. Um, so, and then, another pattern is just with student leadership that I think is super interesting. In the opening decades of the 20th century, the student body presidents were always white guys. And often the vice president would be a girl. My sister got really pissed off in 1964 when she ran for vice president and lost to a boy because she said, it's just not fair. Everybody knows a boy is going to be president, so a girl should get the vice presidency. It was sort of a set aside in her mind, for a second class kind of position. Now, and CJ's most recent book I think is really good for looking at this as well. Now, almost all for the last 20 years, really, almost all the leadership is all girls. And at this school, almost all Latinas now too. And so where are the boys in clubs? Where are the boys in student leadership? And what does this tell us? And CJ's got some really interesting sort of insights on this in her new book. Nice is Not Enough is the title.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question, and this one is from Stacy.
Sorry about that. On the theme of sports helping form community identity, one of the fascinating things I've noticed in recent years is high school classmates who were in those popular crowds of cheerleaders and stuff, promoting online their kids participating in those same pageants of homecoming parades, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm curious if you noticed any kind of local dynasty kind of behavior happening where your kids are following in your own footsteps and they're saying that my dad was, the star baseball player and I'm going to be there too, kind of a thing happening. And particularly if that's being affected at all by just mobility in general. I know the boomers moved a lot right after the war. You were suddenly in new places. You weren't going to the same high school as your parents did. But did you see anything like that or completely contradicting that in your exploration of Salinas?
Some of that for sure. I mean, you have some real big demographic shifts taking place where, a lot of the kids probably at the school now, their parents didn't go to the school. But over the years, you see a lot of the same names, of sort of legacy, sort of generations of kids, and especially the names of people who were very big in developing the whole industry of agriculture in the early 20th century. You still see some of those names of those people at the school. Another thing that you see, I think that's shifted that terrain just a little bit is that even though you might see parents kind of reintroducing their kids into the same activities that they did when they were in school, some of the meanings of those activities have shifted. And in particular, I think the college recruitment has had something to do with this, that colleges have shifted more towards non-academic criteria So if you're doing sports, or you're a cheerleader, or you're in various kinds of clubs, all of those kind of extracurriculars are taking on a lot more importance. And so high schools have actually developed, and there's a social scientist by the name of Kirsten Heckstrom who's written a lot about this, have developed a lot of programs for kind of imagining how they might feed their kids into college opportunities. And so certain types of sports on the West Coast have developed that maybe were previously only on the East Coast, like lacrosse in high schools. And that tends to be sports that white middle class kids are in greater numbers disproportionately. And it also tends to be a sport where colleges actually have proportionally more openings for athletes, scholarship athletes, than football and basketball, which is where more kids of color are concentrated. So I think you see some shifts taking place in why kids play sports, or why kids of certain social classes play sports and participate in other extracurriculars, and what that means to them in terms of kind of creating a profile for how they move forward in their lives.
We have somebody here who would like to ask a question, but is not able to raise his hand through Zoom, and that's Juan. And I think we have just enough time for you to squeeze in something quick.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Mike. I graduated with Mike, but I transferred in my end of my junior year from Gonzales High School. And for me, there were personal reasons for that, but for me, I always grew up thinking Salinas was like Emerald City. And Gonzales was just, or Soledad. I actually lived in Soledad, and you see that in Steinbeck novels, all these little towns. And it was just an interest. It was a cultural, what's the word? Not a clash, but I just had to adjust to the culture in Salinas High, because Salinas High was, Gonzales High School was basically children of Swiss farmers, dairy farmers, and then the rest were of color, Filipino and Mexican primarily, and I'm both, Filipino father, Mexican mother. But it was just interesting making the adjustment to Salinas High. And just to give you one example, I won't go over too long. Salinas High School senior class of 1970 was larger than the whole entire school of Gonzales High School. And I had a great English teacher, Miss Blount at that time, and I had never seen a live play in San Francisco primarily until the English class went on a field trip to see my first live play. So that kind of gives you this feeling of just how different it was. My mother was a farm laborer and worked in the packing sheds for Big Ag in Salinas, and my dad was a field laborer. So there was just a real adjustment, a good one though. And I never really, I don't even know if I had met Mike personally. I knew who he was because he was on the basketball team, but when I actually got to know him later through Facebook, and I was just delighted to see that he was a sociologist, because we could have great discussions. But it was just great to have the book, and just know it was from Mike for one, and then because I actually bought two, I'm going to give one to a person who graduated later and from Salinas High. So, but Mike was kind enough to, I didn't make it to his book sign-in, but he was kind enough to send me a signature and a little thing that I put in the book, because I wanted a signature so bad. Anyway, it's not academic by any means. And I mean, my commentary, it's just personal. And that's really all I needed to say. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you, Juan. It's really nice to see you and to hear from you. And everybody can maybe see behind Juan that he's a very accomplished artist. And precisely, he makes the point that he said we didn't really know each other in high school, and he is one of those people probably I should have known in high school if I wanted to be more cool and have a more interesting life. But I'm glad we connected now.
This has just been terrific. And Rebecca, I don't know if you are the person who closes it down.
I do close it down, and I just put in the chat a link to our video archive, which includes past talks as well as this talk will be in there, and then also to our YouTube channel. And so my job is very simple, and it's just to basically thank CJ and Jeff for your wonderful comments and questions, and to Mike for having written this book, and Alice, thank you to you, but most of all to Mike for the book, for the occasion, and thank you all for being here. It's really a time for a community and for ideas shared together, so I especially appreciate this. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.